Então, boa noite a todas as pessoas. É um enorme prazer a gente ter a oportunidade dessa primeira palestra, né, nesse dia tão produtivo. E eu tenho o prazer de apresentar muito brevemente, né, porque deve ser que a gente tenha tempo de ouvir, né, o professor Bryan. Ele pediu para que as pessoas cheguem aqui para frente, porque aí ele vai até abandonar o texto e vai fazer uma conversa mais informal. Então ele pediu para que as pessoas cheguem aqui para frente, que ele, acho que não vai nem usar microfone, então ele fez essa solicitação, que aí a gente também tem uma chance de uma conversa um pouco mais informal. Para quem ainda não viu, existe a versão em português, que o Marcelo criou esse QR Code aqui, então é possível baixar o texto em português, tá? Então, reforçando essa solicitação dele para que as pessoas se aproximem. O professor Bryan é um professor emérito de estudos canadenses da Trent University, no Canadá. É um historiador reconhecido, né, do trabalho e da esquerda, com uma vasta produção. Publicou, por exemplo, a obra James Buchanan and the Emergence of Trotskyism in the United States, 1928-1938, e a obra que é muito importante para o nosso evento, que é do Arthur Thompson, Objeções e Oposições, né, que foi traduzido para o português e está num preço muito especial num desses sites aí de venda online, né? Eu fui procurar, então fica a dica para quem se interessar. E também autor de muitos artigos sobre Thompson, e é uma figura muito importante para que a gente tenha aqui no evento para esse diálogo. Então, em nome da organização, eu agradeço muitíssimo a sua disponibilidade, vinda, e é um enorme prazer te ouvir novamente. Ele esteve aqui já, acho que foi uns 10 years ago that you were here, e uns 10 anos atrás, e foi um enorme prazer. Ele participou de várias aulas aqui, então é um prazer novamente tê-lo na UF. Então, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I want to say how delighted and honored I am to be here at a conference on Thompson's 100th anniversary, and to see the interest there is in Brazil, which I've always known about for Thompson, an interest that I think is waning somewhat in the English-speaking world for a variety of reasons. I love being in Brazil, and so I want to thank very much the conference organizers, although for the introduction, Marcelo in particular for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I'm always treated exceedingly well, and I very much enjoyed being here, so it's a pleasure. I also want to be apologetic and embarrassed at my lack of language skills, which forces me to talk to you in English, which I appreciate you suffering through that. And because of, it's been a very long day, and a great day, but because also of the audience, I think I'll skip the presentation where I was going to get to the podium and dance around. I was going to come down here and speak to you more, but the technology people tell me that's not a possibility, so I have to speak with the microphone from up here, from on high. What I really wanted to do today is in some sense, speak about Thompson as a very paradoxical figure, as someone who was awkward in whatever place one wants to situate him. He was never very comfortable being in any school. He was never very comfortable being in any organization, although there are Thompsonians all over the world now who would consider themselves part of his school. And there are organizations and movements and mobilizations that he valued intensely, that he was himself a part of and indeed played pivotal roles in. But he was himself a paradoxical, sometimes contradictory figure, and that's really what I want to sort of focus on. And in some senses, make clear that attempts to classify him and sort of typecast him never really work. And I'll start with an anecdote to introduce him and to introduce his sort of paradoxical nature. Is that sometime around 1964, an elderly woman was riding the subway, the Underground in London. And this woman was from a missionary background. She herself was a writer. Her husband, whom she had helped with many, many books, plays, novels, poems, was also a part of her family background. She herself was American, but transplanted to England and also to Lebanon and India through the relationship with her husband. And as she was riding the subway, or the Underground, she noticed a young man, this was late 63 or early 1964, reading a big fat book titled The Making of the English Working Class. She looked over at him and said, "Is that a good book?" And he said, "Oh, it is fantastic. It's wonderful. It just is shifting, all kinds of ways of looking at English history." And he went on with superlatives of many kinds, and all she could ever answer was, "Really? Really? Really? It's that good?" He said, "Yes." Well, that woman was Theodosia Jessup Thompson. Her husband was Edward John Thompson, who had written one of many books called The Making of the Indian Princess, which of course had been influential in Thompson's title, although I don't believe he ever mentioned that in the actual preface to The Making. Thompson grew up in a family where he was considered in some senses very much the second son. His brother, Frank Thompson, had been killed by fascists in World War II, executed by Nazis in what is now Yugoslavia. And Frank was brilliant, by all accounts. He was Edward's older brother, and in some senses, Edward lived in his shadow as a youth. Frank was a gifted poet. He was a skilled linguist, spoke many languages. He was seen to be, in some senses, a writing family's heritage. When he was killed, and Edward himself, who followed Frank into the Communist Party and followed him into World War II as well. Edward was a tank commander, I think only 19 or 20 years old, in Italy at the time that his brother was killed. And his father wrote him, and I find this astounding, to say, "Edward, you have to survive this war so that Frank can live through you." Now, what a legacy that is to live with. His mother wrote him a letter saying how tragic that Frank, who was so brilliant and so gifted, has died. And those of us who are useless and second-rate have survived. Now, I wouldn't make too much of this, and I do want to stress that one response to that, in a sibling rivalry sense, might be resentment. Edward never resented his brother Frank. He loved him, he revered him, and both his first book, There Is a Spirit in Europe, and his last book on the failed Bulgarian mission of his brother, related to Frank. But Edward always considered himself, if you can imagine, the man we celebrate today of 100 years of contribution, possible contributions to the writing of history and sort of political struggles on the left, considered himself a kind of duffer in a family of writers, considered himself always second-rate, was very much disparaging of his own, in some sense, his contributions. So there's that paradox in the family legacy. But more paradoxical, really, was also the sense that we're celebrating a Thompson whose works we all have, indeed, a great respect for. When they first appeared, they appeared to, at the very sort of at the ending of the official Cold War. But there was still a Cold War mentality in historiographic circles at the time. The early reviews of the making of the English working class were by no means positive. Theodosia Thompson was not the only skeptic about her son's sort of great literary work. The right wing attacked it viciously as an engaged and enragé history. They saw Thompson's claims in the preface that causes that have been lost in England might yet be won in Asia or Africa. They saw this as sort of opening a Pandora's box of anti-capitalist challenge at a time when capitalism needed the sort of buttressing of all the right-thinking people. There was great worry that Thompson's prose, which was both irreverent in terms of its sort of refusal of academic proprieties and conventions. They saw Thompson's prose as carrying a kind of libidinal charge that might ignite what appeared to be an already sort of youthful mobilization in the making. There was great worry that this book was not only being read by students, it was being bought by them. Can you imagine students purchasing a book of this weight and size and nature? So there was hostility, and among even elements of the left, there was a great deal of criticism of Thompson for not being, for instance, sufficiently Marxist. There was a view that he was more the radical Tory, cast in the mold of sort of William Cobbett, than being a Marxist of the sort that was needed. Even Eric Hobsbawm, who no doubt remembered the 1956 and the break from the Communist Party that Thompson had played a role in leading against what he increasingly perceived as its kind of sort of Stalinist cul-de-sacs. Even Eric, who didn't always get along with Thompson, said in a review of the New Statesman that Thompson had long been recognized on the left as an historian of extraordinary gifts, but he was a man incapable of self-criticism, and the making reflected that. So there was all kinds of carping, and the real impact of the making really did not register until, in some senses, later decades, when it was acknowledged by the 70s and 80s that this was a book that had sort of reoriented our understandings of class away from mechanical, sort of economistic understandings. It was recognized that this was a book that had sort of transformed the nature of the historiography of the working classes. It was a book that in its sensuous prose treated its subject, working class people, with the same kind of sentience that their own lives had reflected. And in some ways, Thompson's method, which was, I think, really in a very simplistic way, captured nicely in Wordsworth's the Prelude from the 1790s, which Thompson, of course, always looked back on. Some lines from that epic poem have always struck me as really guiding Thompson, and he quoted them in a Mansbridge adult education lecture in 1968. When I began to inquire, to watch and question those I met, and held familiar talk with them, the lonely roads were schools to me in which I daily read, with most delight, the passions of mankind. There saw into the depths of human souls, souls that appear to have no depth at all, to vulgar eyes, and now convinced at heart how little that to which alone we give the name of education hath to do with real feeling and just sense. Now this seems very simple, but in some senses it was what Thompson's method and what the making of the English working class was really all about. It was about recovering, and of course Thompson did this not through talking to people his roads were not ones where he encountered these people. Rather, he encountered them in archives and in provincial writings and literatures and in obscure sources that, particularly in his homeland of the time in Yorkshire, in the north of England, he mined with just incredible diligence and great imagination and ingenuity. The paradoxes of Thompson were that, of course, that he was a Marxist in his origins, who then came to see Marxism differently as he matured. His break from the Communist Party in 1956 really steeled him in a lifelong dedication to the necessity of challenging both the political and the intellectual sort of crimes of Stalinism. This meant that he was not only in his left-wing attachments to the commitment to struggling for social justice, setting his sights only against the right, but also against the left. So that there was always, he fit in awkwardly in any situation. He was an historian whose work was as theoretical as any historian, but someone who self-deprecated his own theoretical capabilities. I cannot understand economics, he said, I think, in his essay on exterminism in the New Left Review. He took, I think, in some senses dangerously a title from Marx, The Poverty of Theory, for one of his theoretical and historical assaults on Stalinism and also on Althusarianism, which he saw as reciprocal modes of thinking and of political practice. His history was always conceived as polemic and argument against the right and its economistic and sort of condescending view of working class life, as well as against left-wing elements that he thought were basically structured into too mechanical an understanding of class formation. He saw both the right and elements of the Stalinist and social democratic left as sort of seeing class formation as the coming of steam power, the erection of the factory system equals the making of the working class. And so what that wrote out of history was the agency of workers themselves and the extent to which those workers didn't simply react to their situation, but drew on reservoirs and resiliencies of past cultures, which is why he went backwards instead of forwards from the making of the English working class. Many people expected him to springboard off of a study of the 1790 to 1830 years into the more modern period. Instead, he went backward. He had all kinds of explanations for this, but one reason was that he wanted to, I think, explore more deeply the resilience and reservoirs that he saw emerging in that period of class formation, which culminated in Chartism and various class struggles of the mid-19th century. The paradox that was Thompson was also reflected in the fact that he was insistent that paradox was also central to historical process. I think there's very few words in the making of the English working class that are used more often than paradox. He referred to the paradox of feeling of those who lived through the cauldron of socioeconomic change and transformation that was the Industrial Revolution. He referred to the paradox of Methodism, where he used that famous and much maligned phrase, psychic masturbation. He referred to the paradox of a religion of the senses and of feelings that nonetheless suppressed working class feeling, suppressed working class sensibilities, repressed working class sensuality. He referred to the paradox of class formation, which wasn't just about a mode of production and how that made workers, although he never denied the objective significance and importance of that structural element. But he referred to the paradoxes of class formation whereby the yeomanry at Peterborough rode them down and the right of freedom of expression was secured. How the pamphleteers were jailed, and from the jails their pamphlets kept being published. He referred to the paradox of women's experience in the 1790s of the sort of patriarchal controls exercised on them, and yet there were women like Mary Wollstonecraft who rose beyond that and pushed for the rights of women and the rights of men. And where this paradox, I think, comes most into view in the making is as well his willingness to challenge conventional wisdoms, not just of the right, but again of the left. A speaker this afternoon mentioned that in Brazil, the making of the English working class is issued in three books. And my guess is that those 3 books are the 3 parts. The 3 parts being, the first one is, I think, The Tree of Liberty. The second one is The Curse of Adam. And the third one is Working Class Consciousness. Well, in The Curse of Adam, which deals with exploitation, the standards of living, and Thompson's reinterpretation of that, and the structural context of the objectification of class, Thompson does hammer away relentlessly at the mainstream academic writing and the sort of conventional right-wing interpretation of industrial revolution as basically progress and advance for workers. I mean, his great line where he could insert his humor and his outrage, really, and anger, which he always recognized as a legitimate, response to both history of oppression and exploitation, and anger as a legitimate response to the way in which that history was being interpreted and written about by those who served as kind of agents of a particular kind of capitalist exploitation. The great line that I never forget is where he ends his discussion of the standard of living by saying, well, who can possibly forget that workers who lived in the shadow of the dark satanic mills of the 19th century lived through years of benevolence and progress. Their gain, some potatoes, some tea, a bit more sugar, and many, many articles in the Economic History Review. And that combined with another line where in the chapter on child labor, where he goes after some of the historians who were writing in what was at the time a major statement, Capitalism and the Historians, which was published in 1954, where one of its leading figures, I think the editor, T.S. Ashton, talks about child labor and says, well, in an age of nuclear annihilation and the Holocaust, who can really get very upset about child labor? And Thompson's response is a very, emphatic, well, we may be allowed a different response, which is that children who were exploited in this shameless manner, I'm paraphrasing, constituted one of the most shameless events in our history. So he never let anyone off the hook. And the right wing certainly, was skewered often and relentlessly in the making. But in the first book, The Tree of Liberty, what's so interesting is the paradox of Thompson, who wrote the book for an adult education audience, an autodidactic audience that would have read a fair bit in England about class experience and would have known something about the Liberty Tree, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Tom Paine's writings. And of course would have been reared in the adult education milieu on the writings of Fabian's English social democrats like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Jael and Barbara Hammond. Now Thompson would defend those people, decisively against the relentless attacks of the right. But in that opening book of The Making of the English Working Class, he felt the need to actually offer his autodidactic adult education audience a different perspective. And so that's where he introduces the Brechtian values of the London crowd, the sort of raucous features of this late 18th and early 19th century plebeian underclass, because it railed against, in some ways, the constitutionalism of Francis Place and the respectable artisan reform orientation that had become embedded in the English working class movement, and that was seen in some senses as a mother's milk of the labor movement and the trade unions. And Thompson wanted to insert into that a more ribald, risque, and openly rebellious aspect of working class experience. And so what he was doing was bringing to the fore the nature of a whole series of groups and experiences, mobilizations and movements that had been seen as archaic, primitive in the very negative sense of the term, and in some senses outside of the respectable face of labor and the legitimate boundaries of the labor movement and its evolution. This is what the Hammonds and the Webbs had basically skirted and shoved to the side. This is what Thompson called the opaque societies, the Luddite movements, the food riots, the sort of more criminalized aspects of working class behavior, uprisings, and resistance. And those were the roads, if we go back to the prelude, and the schools that Thompson decided to enter into through a reconsideration of these movements and mobilizations. And this, is the message of the preface, that those historical actors who, in the overworked wording of the preface, who've been subjected to the enormous condescension of posterity, Thompson was recovering and placing at the forefront of the resistance. And this is what angered so much the conservative reviewers of The Making of the English Working Class. Gertrude Himmelfarb, for instance, who was kind of part of a New York circle of fairly once left-wing but increasingly right-wing commentators, was said that Thompson is not only engagé, he's enragé. He was enraged. So Thompson, is tilting against really what the conventional social democratic Fabian left, but not as left as he wanted. And he was doing so because when he wrote this book in the aftermath of the Second World War, he saw the labor movement somewhat tamed, somewhat domesticated. Developments like the rise of the welfare state, the recognition of collective bargaining, the rise and then sort of consolidation and domestication of the Labor Party. All is something that he needed to challenge. Equally, he did the same kind of thing in part 3, or book 3 of The Making of the English Working Class, where he looked at working class consciousness, and he challenged very directly the notion that this is where he sort of brought in Luddism, brought in machine breaking, he brought in the opaque underground to armies of redressers, nighttime mobilized under the cover of darkness to thwart the factory system that they didn't, in the end, defeat. But that Thompson always saw as an heroic effort, one that, because it didn't end in success, shouldn't necessarily have been written out of the sort of historical record of resistance and challenge. And I think the reason that the making of the English working class resonated so loudly over the decades of the last years of the 20th century was that this perspective allowed all kinds of entrees into new ways of appreciating, researching, and being sensitized to subordinate groups. The reason that slave rebellions could be interpreted in a Thompsonian framework were that these too were groups that didn't necessarily, in the immediacy of their resistance, always strike out successfully against their oppressors and their exploiters. But that didn't mean that they weren't harboring resentments and, engaging in resistance and fighting fights that would, of course, in the long haul of history, be recognized as on the right side of trying to defeat social injustices of all kinds. Even though Thompson has been much criticized for not appreciating gender, for instance, there are feminist historians who are very critical of Thompson, but there are others who see that his approach sensitized them to ways of looking at experience that allowed them entree into a range of appreciations of the undercurrents of resistance. So the paradox of Thompson and the importance of paradox in historical experience has meant really that it is very difficult to classify here. And in some ways, my view is that the way that Thompson needs to be understood is the same way that he understood what was his first historical, really deeply historical foray of interpretation, the subject of class itself. In the preface, which is probably what most people read, and many people bypass the three books that constitute the actual study, sadly. In the preface, he said that class, is not a thing. It's not an objective, concrete, mechanical undertaking. Rather, he described it as an historical happening. And I think that's the way Thompson needs to be understood, as an amazingly creative, historical happening. One conditioned, as he said about class, as much by agency as by objective determinations. And one that, remember he said about class, at any given point in time, if you try to stop it with a finely meshed kind of net, capturing its essence and meaning, you will miss it. It will pass you by. It will sieve through the net and be gone. And in some senses, that's true of Thompson. Because, you can look at him in the late 1940s and in the 1950s when he was writing the William Morris book, and you can see the Marxist, the member of the Communist Party. Then, as soon as you've determined that that is what he is, 56 happens. And he's critiquing Stalinism. He's making his exit from the Communist Party. He's breaking from certain aspects, not all aspects, certain aspects of what he considered a kind of deformed Marxism, the base superstructure analysis he thought was inadequate to capturing the sort of, dialectics of the relationships of the base and superstructure, of the economy and of culture and of class formation and class struggle. And then he's involved very much in the first, anti-nuclear arms movement, CND. And he's involved in the New Left, where he helps to found, through the 1950s journals, The Reasoner and The New Reasoner, and the Universities and Left Review, which he wasn't so much involved with, the New Left Review, where he was a founding figure and editor. And he then has debates. Again, he's arguing with everyone all the time. Debates with Perry Anderson that seem to be, for many of us looking back on them, quite acidic, quite, how should I put it, very, in their polemical nature. They speak of a rupture. But the rupture, as Anderson would later acknowledge in a memoriam when Thompson died in the 90s, was never that complete. And for instance, Dorothy Thompson told me once, after Edward was dead, that the New Left Review, when it was founded, gave people shares according to their contributions, material and otherwise, to the journal. And Edward and Dorothy always had shares in the New Left Review. And over the years, Perry Anderson and the various teams that he led editorially there, often ended up in faction fights on the journal. And there were times when there were meetings of the shareholders. At every point, Edward and Dorothy and their shares aligned with Perry, because they said he kept this going. He kept the journal going. And they thought that was the preeminent. And they weren't convinced that those opposing Anderson were going to be able to actually do the same thing. So there's a reciprocity there in the arguments that I think need to be borne in mind retrospectively. And by the 70s, of course, as he again argued very strongly against what he considered to be, an Althutherian, theoreticist, and Stalinist approach to not just history but to political practice, he again made enemies on the left. And he grew increasingly distant from many of those people through his involvement in the second anti-nuclear arms campaign, where again there were differences that relate to understandings of imperialism, understandings of the Soviet Union, understandings of the sort of stasis of the Cold War blocs that many on the left disagreed with him about. The point I'm trying to sort of make is that while Thompson may have, again, be impossible to classify on this grid, on this spectrum, what he never lost sight of in terms of Marxism was considerations of himself as an historical materialist. He was always an historical materialist, but he insisted on infusing historical materialism with what he saw was both a silence in Marx that grew to really a pernicious influence in Stalinism and certain other variants of Marxism and the Marxist tradition. He no longer felt by the 70s and 80s that there was one singular Marxist tradition, nor did he ever feel that there was one singular way of, encompassing a theory that would actually allow one entry into the complexities of human experience and of historical process. Minds which thirst for tidy Platonism, I think he wrote in the Peculiarities of the English, are always going to be impatient with history. And impatient with Thompson, is my point. Impatient with Thompson, too. And I think that really what I want to close with, in some senses, is a very generous obituary that was written by Eric Hobsbawm. Because I think in spite of these shifts, there were also continuities in Thompson. His later historical studies focused on the 18th century, for instance, afforded an opportunity for Thompson to explore the dialectic of interaction between economics and values, between need and morality, and how they meshed with relations of power. Customs in Common, with its centerpiece, the 1971 past and present article, The Moral Economy of the English Crowd, and the long response that he wrote in that to literatures that the moral economy of the English crowd generated. And it's really quite a extraordinary chapter in the sense that it shows you how much that article actually elicited in terms of responses, and I can't think of another article that actually elicited the level of response that Thompson's The Moral Economy of the English Crowd generated. And Whigs and Hunters and the Origins of the Black Act, and Thompson's discussion of the anonymous threatening letter in the book that he edited with his students, Albion's Fatal Tree. All of this writing, as well as his long interest in William Blake, which culminated, I think, in a book that would have been different had he been healthier and actually had he lived longer. But a book, Witness Against the Beast, William Blake and the Moral Law. All of this continued a project of historical and political writings that Thompson had initiated in the 1950s and early 1960s, which included, of course, the William Morris book, Romantic to Revolutionary, the New Reasoner, the New Left Review, and the Making of the English Working Class. The purpose of all of this work was really the rehabilitation of lost categories and lost vocabularies in the Marxist and dissident and radical traditions. And rejecting Stalinism, Thompson was transfixed by the problem of the degeneration of the theoretical vocabulary of mainstream orthodox Marxism, the impoverishment of its sensibility, the primacy of the categories that denied the effective existence of moral consciousness, the extrusion, he said, of whole areas of imaginative passions. The melding of politics, passions, and paradox was, in so many rich and complex ways, I think, the making of Edward Palmer Thompson, a man who wrote histories passionately and strove with equal passion to make history. And really, he is alone among us, I think, in the way in which he tried not only to write histories, but to make history, particularly in the last years of his life with the nuclear disarmament campaign. And all of this was premised on oppositional stances that brought him to the forefront of national and international campaigns, but that remained very difficult to peg. He's an enigmatic figure among the pantheon of socialist historians, writers, and theorists of the 20th century, but nonetheless one that in his uniqueness and imaginative brilliance repays consideration again and again and again, which is why we're here 100 years after his birth. Hobsbawm was in some senses a detached and cool persona compared to the hot and engaged persona of Thompson. And if you'd ever had any contact with the two men, even sitting around having a drink with them, you'd see this. Edward could be volcanic and explosive, theatrical. Eric was always cool, calm, contained, brilliant, but, reserved. Thompson was never reserved. Hobsbawm noted that Edward, with whom he did not always get along, was sui generis. He was alone, in some senses, among figures. His admirers, Hobsbawm said, forgave him much, excusing what Hobsbawm referred to as Thompson's fluctuating moods, an uncertain relation to organizations and organization men, and an occasional hit and miss quality in the excursions of his powerful and imaginative intellect into theory. But his friends, Hobsbawm conceded, perhaps with a touch of envy, forgave Edward everything. And no wonder. They appreciated that they were not about to experience anyone quite like Edward Palmer Thompson ever again. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Very nice. Agora é a hora da gente, enfim, a gente ainda tem um tempinho, se alguém puser a fazer alguma questão, enfim, a gente, qualquer coisa pode ser em português, a gente pode ajudar aqui da melhor forma possível, né? Só no início, né, a gente pensando aqui na tradução, né, da dificuldade de, às vezes, fazer esse processo de tradução. O Bryan estava contando que ele estava num evento na China, um evento marxista na China, I was studying about the translation document. E aí ele falou que tinha uma tradução de inteligência artificial atrás, era um evento marxista, e todas as vezes que aparecia relações de produção, era traduzido como sexo. Aí ele falou que as pessoas ficavam um pouco constrangidas, enfim. E o nome dele, Bryan Palmer, saía Brand Power, né? Enfim, então, como a tradução da inteligência artificial pode ser um pouco perigosa às vezes, enfim. Mas a gente abre aqui, enfim, para quem, né, eu acho que foi bem emocionante terminar, enfim, como também terminou com esse obituário, também acho que traz bastante impacto, né? Se alguém tem alguma questão. Eu tenho uma, vou fazer primeiro em português e depois no inglês terrível, mas a gente é isso mesmo, a gente faz um esforço no que dá, né? O importante é entender. Eu também faço em português, né?
Yes.
Você estava mencionando um pouco dessa recepção, né, do Thompson, que sofreu, na verdade, acabou sendo um pouco, no caso da formação da classe operária inglesa, que foi um pouco atacada, bastante atacada pela direita, mas também sofreu críticas na esquerda, né? E no início da sua fala você menciona um pouco que essa recepção atual, enfim, né, ou a leitura atual, no caso dos países centrais, enfim, né, tem diminuído e um pouco sobre isso. E aí eu queria te perguntar um pouco sobre essa de que forma atualmente tem essa dimensão da obra de Thompson tem reverberado, né? Enfim, na tradução aqui capenga, mas vamos lá. You mentioned that the reception of the making of the working class was he had suffered some criticism from the left, from the right. But at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned also that in countries like USA or Canada, the work of Thompson is not today so reading or so strength that it was before. And I would like that you could mention also how nowadays you see this the work of Thompson is being reading, or how is being presented in the universities, and the impact today.
Yeah. I would.
Tem mais perguntas. Sorry, you have a.
Pode ser.
What do you prefer? To answer the first and then have the second? Then?
Yeah, I'll answer that first and then. My view, and it is only my view perhaps, but I think it's based on a judgment about how Thompson is read in both in the English-speaking world right now, Anglo-American, Canada, England, the United States. I don't think Thompson is read very widely right now. I don't think the making of the English working class would be assigned in very many graduate seminars. in part because no one would read that much, but it's more than that. Maybe the preface is assigned, but the preface is brilliant, idiosyncratic, in the best sense of the word, unique, but it doesn't really give you the flavor of the book as a whole. And for instance, I read The Making of the English Working Class in the 1970s when I had quit university and was involved in the New Left. I'd left Canada. I went to live in 1969 and 70 to catch the tail end of Students for Democratic Society, and I read it in a place called Alternate U, which was a movement institution. I then went back to school, finished a BA, went to graduate school, and we did read it in a graduate seminar on the history of the Industrial Revolution. I can't see people in what are social movements now reading The Making of the English Working Class like I did in the social movements of the late 60s and early 70s. And I can't see them reading it in a graduate seminar either. And mainly, as I experience Thompson's reception in the current moment in the English-speaking world, it is largely to critique what he did not do. He did not say enough about gender, or what he said about gender was not said in the right way. He did not say enough about empire and colonialism. He did not say enough about race. These are the areas where many young people are working, where the fashions of historiography, if you want to use such a term, and I don't necessarily use it in a derogatory way, have changed. The problem with this is, I think, that they misunderstand both what he wrote and what it was possible for someone to write when he was writing. So take the critique of gender. I think there is a lot of gender in The Making of the English Working Class, but he dealt with gender as part of working class families, both in terms of labor and in terms of politics. It was gendered, but he did write about it. But also, Thompson was moving, as I tried to convey in the talk. You can hardly say that gender doesn't factor into customs in common. I mean, it is central to the moral economy of the crowd. It's central to the chapter on rough music and Charlerie. Now, it's also central to an area that has upset many contemporary feminists, the chapter on the sale of wives. But that strikes me as a very two-sided area. There is in the ritualistic sale of wives, which Thompson, by the way, regarded as a barbaric aspect of the plebeian culture when he wrote The Making of the English Working Class. It's just a footnote that references Hardy's, the mayor of Casterbridge's reference to it. But when he got into researching it, he came to a different conclusion, that this was, while the ritual was, of course, offensive to women, particularly women with the sensibilities of 20th and 21st century feminist politics. You know, marching a woman into the market with a halter around her neck, hoisting her up on a table, and, quote, knocking her down to the highest bidder. This, you know, enrages contemporary sensibilities. But what he did, not unlike what he did in much of The Making of the English Working Class, was look at the way that this actually happened in practice. The ritual had its ugliness, which was part of a patriarchal culture that it was impossible, in some senses, to step outside of. But the highest bidder was never just the highest bidder. It was always a man with whom the woman had an established relationship already. A marriage had broken down, a family had broken down. There was no recourse to divorce. And the ritual was apparently agreed to by all parties. And so it was a transfer of a relationship that was no longer functional to a new relationship. Ralph Samuel, who was the founder of the History Workshop Journal, articulated a feminist critique of this and said, well, if you want to understand gender relations, it's the ugliness of the wife's tale that really is paramount. And you consider this alongside desertion of wives and children, traffic in women, rape, wife beating, etc. And that will give you the picture of gender relations that Thompson obscures. Well, I don't think Thompson ever wrote the chapter on the wife's tale as an all-encompassing statement on the totality of the nature of gender relations. What Samuel refused was any solidarities of working class or plebeian men and women, and instead drew a hard, and fast binary opposition between men and women in the gender relations of the 18th century. Thompson didn't have any all-encompassing notion of those gender relations, but he was saying, here's a way that men and women negotiated the realities of the facts that relationships break down, families come apart. And here's the way they negotiated the fact that the law had no place that recognized this. It locked them into really the sort of endurance test of relationships that were no longer functional. And so, in a way, that was, it seems to me, that's a way of looking at an aspect of gender relations that's illuminating. It's not going to be the totality of the answer, and it contains within it, problems for Thompson's analysis, no doubt about it. The moral economy of the English crowd, I think, is different in the sense that there, he made a very explicit argument that women were involved in these struggles, sometimes with men, sometimes entirely or on their own. And they were part of a class struggle against patrician, overlords, demanding of the economy that it have a moral dimension where bread and its availability was central. And what he did was, it seems to me, takes, the gender relations of the time and show that women were capable of stepping outside of the patriarchal bounds of the household to be involved in the public sphere and to be involved in class struggles of a kind that, again, the Hammonds and the Webbs would not have recognized because they weren't part of the constitutionalist reform evolution of the trade union movement. And in the gender critique of the making of the English working class, which is generally to say that it doesn't include enough women, I don't see people taking the whole of Thompson and looking at customs in common, the moral economy of the crowd, etc., sufficiently. It's like, for instance, a woman that's very much associated with the gendered critique of the making of the English working class, and it's very important for post-structuralist gendered history in the U.S. is Joan Scott. You've heard of Joan Scott, right? Well, she wrote a book on gender, a useful analysis of history, or I forget the exact subtitle, but it's gender as a main analytic point for entering into historical interpretation. She wrote that in 1988. Her first book, written in 1974, The Glassworkers of Carmaux, contained virtually not a word on gender. An article she did with Eric Hobsbawm, published in Past and Present, published after that, on political shoemakers, contained not a word on gender. So it's like, the critique of Thompson as a genderless historian, on the basis of the making of the English working class, a book written in the late 50s and very early 60s. It would be sort of like treating Joan Scott on gender by considering the glassworkers of Carmel and not the 1988 book. That's paradoxical. It's also ahistorical, it seems to me. Anyway, that would be my long answer.
Which was Thompson's perspective about analysis?
Oh, the analysis. Cool. Yeah. I think he did publish the rough music article in Anal, his discussion of Charivari, an earlier version. I think the place to find his perspective on Anal is in an essay that's not very often referred to. It's an afterword to a book by Jack Goody on forget the exact title, but it's basically on land, tenure, enclosures that runs from the 13th century to the 18th century. And Edward wrote a very long piece there, and he did refer to a number of Anal historians, including Mark Bloch, whom he was very positive towards. I think he regarded Anal as having, how should I put it, made immense contributions to understanding, the structural longue durée kind of evolution of societies. But he probably would have seen them, especially when he was, when he was writing The Making of the English Working Class, the kind of questions he was concerned with on consciousness and sensibilities. I don't think the Anal approach to mentalities would have quite fit with that. So again, I think you would have to look at him at different periods to understand his approach to Anal. And as he, when he wrote The Making of the English Working Class, he was, according to him, virtually uninterested in the academic reception of the book. Now, given that it really is the reception has been academically quite significant over the long haul, I think he misjudged somewhat. But Anal would have seemed to him at that point perhaps scholastic, academic. I can't remember if he ever referred to Brodel. Do you know? No. Bloch he certainly did, and he had, regarded Bloch very highly. So I think his approach to Anal probably would have been differentiated. This piece of it he liked, this piece of it perhaps useful, but not necessarily, in his bailiwick. Leroy Ladurie, I think he had some affinity for some of the earlier works, and some of the again, it's around the questions of land, tenure, enclosure, where he would have seen the influence of Anal as in terms of English historical as quite positive. It's a good question, but one that I feel in some sense is inadequate to answer.
Vou tentar imitar o Paulo aqui, né? Mas muito sinteticamente o que eu quero perguntar para o Bryan tem a ver com o estilo da escrita do Thompson, muito carregado de emoções, como ele falou aqui, às vezes raiva, muita ironia, sarcasmo, né? Esse tom polêmico, mas talvez o quanto esse estilo emotivo pode ter a ver com o público a quem ele queria se dirigir, que não era propriamente o público acadêmico, mas especialmente o quanto isso tem a ver com a experiência que o Thompson teve com a educação de adultos trabalhadores. Né? E começar justamente, não é coincidência que, por exemplo, o Bryan tenha dito que foi num projeto de movimento social que ele começa a ler Thompson, porque eu, por exemplo, comecei a ler Thompson quando eu dava aula num projeto de um sindicato que chamava-se justamente Universidade para os Trabalhadores. Tem uma coincidência de data com a época da publicação, da formação da classe trabalhadora aqui, no português, mas também tem a ver com o fato de que o que mais me entusiasmou foi quando, lendo sobre o lançamento, descobri que aquele autor era um autor que dava aula em projetos com trabalhadores. So, Bryan, the idea is to explore you a little bit more in the sense that you talked about here, about the emotions Thompson carry on his writings. So, there is a kind of a style in Thompson's writings, and how much do you think this style has to do with the experience Thompson had teaching for working class adults, and that idea you mentioned that he was writing for them when he wrote The Making of the English Working Class, and it's not coincidence that you mentioned here that your first contact or first systematic reading of Thompson was when you were in a social movements project. My first readings were when I was teaching in a union project named University for the Workers, and so on and so forth. So this combination of emotions, strong emotions in his style and his teaching, how do you think it can be combined?
Yeah, this is a very important area because I think part of what is unique about Thompson, and certainly a part of what Hobsbawm thought was sui generis about him, was his tone, was his style. And it is a tone and a style that he developed when teaching adult education. And he was teaching as much literature as history. And so the importance of a theatrical presentation, both because it's how you held your audience, which was an adult education audience, and because of the nature of what he was teaching, which lent itself to a particular kind of dramatization. And this carried over, by the way, into his, why he became such an effective campaigner for the anti-nuclear movement. I mean, his theatrical performances were always riveting. And, when he spoke to audiences, he would be quoting William Blake, and they, to tens of thousands of people in an anti-nuclear disarmament, and he would carry it off. Now, the tone and the style too were part of his belief, rightly or wrongly, that the left needed its own forums. It needed its own spaces. It needed its own places. And he thought those places should be places of sharp debate and difference in the clarification of positions. And this was part of the adult education movement too. When you teach in those situations, and I've taught in some of them, you will see a very different tone of discussion. It isn't hostile, it's not necessarily entirely antagonistic, but it can be quite sharp. Disagreements are posed forcefully. And Thompson always thought the left needed these spaces. he always said, and he regretted, that after the making of the English working class, his own writing took on a different tone, because he had been so sharply criticized by professional mainstream historians that when he was writing in the later 60s and 70s, the articles like Time and Work Discipline or The Moral Economy, when he was writing then, he felt inhibited. He had to watch himself. He had to have more evidence to defend his arguments against hostile right-wing critique. And he carried that debate in that style and that tone, very much so into the discussion around Althuserianism and poverty of theory. And in the Kalikowski open letter, too, of the early 70s. This alienated many leftists who were not reared in basically what one might call a school of hard knocks that maybe the Communist Party had been part of, because it was constantly assailed. If you were speaking as a Communist Party member in the 40s and 50s, you had to expect that you would be, attacked. If you were selling the newspaper or you were speaking at a public meeting, you would be attacked by Labour Party or by, right-wing Tory figures in the workers' movement. So you had to be able to, the give and take had to be there. And clearly the early New Left was part of that. That's where the debates with Anderson come out of, which people, of later generations go back and read those and they say, wow, this is like too angry. This is too hostile. But it was a school of sharp criticism that Thompson thought needed to exist, and he never relinquished that in the political sphere. He gave a bit of it up in his more academic writings, because he felt he had to basically protect himself from the criticisms that he felt would be coming. Now, a modern left, I think, it doesn't understand this. Doesn't understand that polemic is a legitimate form. I hope I don't offend anybody, but I would, in Canada, I'm constantly castigated for being too polemic, too harsh, by a left that is, I would say, is a soft left. I mean, they're progressive, very, they do wonderful things. They're part of a mass mobilizations that are aiming to stop war and do this and that. But they do not want those separate spaces for the left to debate hard questions itself. And a consequence, I think, is that the left has just been inevitably more and more fragmented. And more sectors of the left are attacked as sectarian. When in some senses, the most sectarian people I've often found are those claiming to be non-sectarians. If you're selling a left-wing newspaper, and somebody spits on the ground at you, Now, also I've seen far-left groups. If you're a Trotskyist, you've been attacked as being a social fascist by Maoist groups in the 70s. You know what, school of hard knocks might develop into. And I'm not advocating that. But I do think the left, if it's going to be rebuilt and regrouped, has to be able to have hard discussions in which there will be different positions. And Thompson was always, very much in favor of that. And because Thompson was, he did regard it as his academic writing later in his life. He regarded it as somewhat different than his political one and activity. Now, he also, I was involved with him in the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s. And he would chastise me for instance, he hauled me aside one time and said, Bryan, you can't talk like that. We have church people. We're aligning, And, I said, well, come on, there's room in the movement for all kinds of people. He was not having any of it. So, it's the fact that he was such a powerful speaker, so dramatic, so theatrical, brilliant. Did anyone in the room see him speak? You should watch
In the YouTube
films,
some-
YouTube. So okay, he was incredible, and there's this famous debate at Oxford, the history workshop, where he debated Stuart Hall and Richard Johnson, Richard Johnson had written a number of pieces criticizing Thompson as a culturalist. Well, and Ralph Samuel, the founder of the history workshop movement, he was very upset that Edward, basically went into this debate to fight, to win the debate. And all Ralph could speak of was, how Thompson kind of ruined the conference. A pall of, kind of rancor hung over it because of this talk. But these people had criticized him in ways that he found, he considered it offensive that people would be saying he was a culturalist. He said, look, I wrote The Making in the English Working Class as an attack against right-wing, conservative, objectifying understandings of class, and left-wing, Stalinist, mechanical understandings of class. And he said, we were engaged at the same time in a debate over culturalism with people like Raymond Williams. I'm no culturalist. And he basically gave as good as he got and then some. And the fact that the other two speakers were not powerful, theatrical, dramatic performers on the stage, this was somehow held against Thompson. Well, and he had nobody in that room, as I understand, other than John Savile, who defended him and said, And again, now you could say that Edward misjudged the tenor and tone of the left in that 1980 or 81 debate, in the sense that he didn't really understand how the left had moved more and more into a kind of the politics of identity and subjectivity and relativism that postmodernism would then take to new levels in the later 80s and 90s. He was fighting like he'd always fought. And, that style and that tone were something that he kept his entire life. He would never give that up. There's a kind of exchange with Tarek Ali in I think one of the YouTube presentations where they're meeting and Edward says, well, how's Perry? And Tarek says, oh, he's good. He's working on Oakeshott, who was a conservative philosopher. And Edward said, yes, I know. He said, Oakeshott's a scoundrel. Tell him to stiffen his tone. The left have to have a space for people who believe in that necessity of that stiffness, I think.
Mais alguma questão? Então, eu quero muitíssimo agradecer ao Bryan Palmer, né? Eu acho que foi uma apresentação muito comovente, né? Começar com essa percepção da mãe e terminar com o obituário, né? Além de todo o meio também, isso é extremamente interessante. Agradecer a todas as pessoas que ficaram aqui até essa hora, nesse frio siberiano que a gente tem aqui, que melhorou um pouquinho. E nos encontramos amanhã, espero que não tão sibéria assim, vamos ver se a gente consegue. Mas muitíssimo obrigado. Thank you very much, Bryan.
Thank
It
you.
was a very pleasure.